Greetings, everyone. Here are the latest analyses of today's important developments. The shocking news is that the small village, only 3 square miles in area, has set a record for a terrifying siege lasting 1,500 days. It far surpasses even the legendary Tokmachka fortress. For more than 4 years, an anonymous small dot on the map of Ukraine has turned into a suffocating armored nightmare and has ruined every elite army of the Kremlin. The battlefield was terrifying. Moscow's giant steel fist was reduced to ashes in hours. The devastating defeat of the Russian assault group, with dozens of tanks and armored vehicles roasted by Ukraine's flames, has exposed the brutal reality of modern warfare. This video will expose the reason why the Russian general staff accepted the loss of more than 2,000 soldiers and hundreds of millions of dollars in equipment, yet remained completely powerless against a ruined rural stronghold. The Russian defense minister declared the area liberated, and the Kremlin issued a nationwide gag order when Defense Minister Andrei Belousov's triumphant victory claims became a battlefield joke just days later. Moscow had to resort to unprecedented internal crackdowns. What humiliating truth is being hidden that has forced Russian universities to threaten to immediately expel any student who dares to discuss the coordinates of this deadly spot? Here is the detailed content and analysis. Stay tuned. Ukraine defeated Russia at Tokmachka, destroying 21 Russian armored vehicles in the battle. Ladies and gentlemen, in the fierce geopolitical chessboard in Ukraine, there are places that, although very small on the military map, carry the weight to change the entire battlefield situation. Tokmachka is exactly such a strategic stronghold. With an area of just 3 square miles, about 8 square kilometers, and a pre-war population of only around 3,000 people, this small village in the Zaporizhia region. At first, it seemed like it would be easily crushed under the tracks of the Kremlin's war machine, just like the fate of countless other settlements across Ukraine. However, the history of conflict chose Tokmachka as the place to witness an astonishing strategic paradox. For more than 4 years, despite the Russian army throwing all its might and relentlessly attacking with the most brutal means of destruction, this land has stood firm with remarkable resilience. The small village, once almost unknown to the world, suddenly became the battleground of one of the longest sieges in modern history. At the same time, it became a miserable frontline quagmire, choking off seemingly unstoppable offensives. To explain this phenomenon of resilient defense, from both military and human perspectives, we must revisit the blood-soaked and tear-stained pages of history of the land belonging to Poloy district in the center of Zaporizhia province. Tokmachka has never been a stranger to the upheavals of war and the tragedies of the times. Founded at the end of the 18th century during the Russian Empire, this land was originally settled by migrants from the regions of Kiev, Chernihiv, and Poltava. These people came here with a burning desire for a better new life. Over the following centuries, the village directly experienced the horrors of the First World War and the bloody battles in Ukraine's war for independence. It constantly changed hands in brutal takeovers. It didn't end there. Tokmachka also survived the Holodomor famine. A man-made disaster, one of the most devastating in Ukraine's history, took the lives of about 3.5 to 5 million people. In this village alone, 281 people were lost. Then came World War II. The darkness of Nazi Germany once again fell over this place before it was liberated by the Red Army. What happened next was commemorated with a monument honoring the brave soldiers. That painful but heroic history seems to have forged a steely will for this land. However, the ups and downs of the past could not have prepared Tokmachka for the devastation of modern conflict. Before 2022, despite all the adversities of history, this small town not only survived, but also prospered quite well. Compared with most rural areas in Ukraine, this place has local industrial facilities, well-developed infrastructure, and especially one of the largest prisons in the region. These are important sources of employment and livelihood opportunities for the local people. However, when 2022 began, the full-scale invasion by Russia broke out, and Tokmachka was immediately swept into a brutal ordeal, just like many other areas in the east. The village was seized during the very first assault by the Russian army. However, just a few months later, Ukrainian forces bravely counterattacked and pushed the occupying troops out of their territory. But the days of suffering for Tokmachka had only just begun in June 2022. The devastating Russian shelling rained down, leveling sturdy buildings that had stood for decades in the blink of an eye. The Village People's Council building was destroyed, And a few weeks later, the prison compound was also severely damaged by bombing. The hail of shells and the whirlwind of war quickly caused the village's population to drop drastically as people had to flee to save their lives. Soon, there were fewer than 100 souls left clinging to this place. Most of them were elderly, sick, unable to leave, or those who had a deep, heartfelt love for their homeland. They refused to leave the home they'd loved all their lives. When the Russian army quickly took control of the neighboring areas in Zaporizhia province. But Tokmachka was in a precarious situation, just 1 mile from the front line, and it became the Kremlin's top target for destruction. As the surrounding towns fell one by one, the fall of Tokmachka seemed to be only a matter of time. By May 2023, the village was just a shadow of its former self. The central square was torn up by shell craters, shrapnel scarred the streets, and the facade of the local school was completely blown away. The remaining people had to survive without water, gas, or electricity for over a year, hiding in dark basements that had now become makeshift shelters. Just 9 miles away, about 15 kilometers. The town of Poloik, occupied by Russia, witnessed tragic scenes as people were forced to evacuate. Children were taken to the Kremlin's re-education camps. For the Russian command, this is a critical geopolitical location, as it is only 1 mile from the strategic town of Oryx and close to the capital Zaporizhia. About 37 kilometers away, if they capture this last stronghold, Russian forces will establish a solid foothold to launch attacks on larger targets, increasing pressure on the regional capital. But then, a historic turning point came in June 2023. It disrupted all of the Kremlin's strategic calculations after they had resiliently endured the initial phase of the invasion and the first year of the brutal war. At the same time, receiving advanced weapons aid from Western allies, the Ukrainian army launched a large-scale counteroffensive to push back Russian forces and reclaim lost territories. Each counteroffensive received special attention, particularly on the southern front, where Zaporizhia became the main focus, aiming to push the front lines away from major cities and halt the Kremlin's advance. However, the opening phase of this highly anticipated counteroffensive unfolded in a harsh and tragic manner. The first attack, led by Ukraine's 47th Assault Brigade and 33rd Mechanized Brigade, encountered a solid defensive wall. The breakthrough attempt became a tragedy, causing heavy losses on Tokmak's land. Full of blood and fire, the prelude to Ukraine's summer counteroffensive ran into a bitter setback and heavy losses when one of their armored formations was hit. They entered a dense minefield on the outskirts of Tokmak, caught in heavy fire and enemy anti-tank missiles. Subsequent battlefield reports revealed a harsh reality. Up to 25 Ukrainian combat vehicles were destroyed or heavily damaged. Among them were at least 5 German-made Leopard 2 main battle tanks. This event immediately sparked a wave of skepticism and deep concern in the media, as well as among international military analysts, as many rushed to predict that Kiev's much-anticipated counteroffensive would soon fail before achieving any results. However, those pessimistic predictions were wrong. The Ukrainian army quickly reorganized, rallied its forces, and even succeeded in recovering some damaged equipment on the battlefield. By shifting to a doctrine of cautious, pragmatic operations and being more patient in the following weeks, they gradually regained their winning momentum. A testament to this is Brigadier General Alexei Horomov, who was later able to announce a highly encouraging achievement when the defensive forces. They regained nearly 2 miles of solid ground around the Tokmakka area since the counteroffensive began. Although they have not been able to completely push Russian forces back as initially hoped, they have succeeded in stabilizing the front line and securing key defensive positions. They have engaged the enemy in a long war of attrition over positions. Both sides keep probing, locking each other in place without achieving any strategic breakthroughs. To explain the reason why, a small dot on the map like Tokmakka can neutralize all attempts to assault it. Russian armored vehicles, assault groups, and drones. Geopolitical analysts have pointed out 2 core factors based on modern military art. First, this is not an isolated phenomenon, but rather a manifestation of a trend, a typical tactic along the entire Russian-Ukrainian front line, turning small residential areas, sometimes consisting of only a single street, with just a few dozen houses, into impregnable defensive fortresses. The Ukrainian army has demonstrated a masterful approach to fortification, surrounding the fields with a dense network of mines, forcing Russian armored units onto predictable, narrow routes that are easy to ambush. The explosion of technology, especially drones in the later stages of the war, has further helped defensive forces accurately track every movement of enemy troops. They can then proactively disrupt enemy attacks early. In addition, although most of the surface structures of Tokmakka have been flattened by shelling, its underground defenses have been greatly reinforced. Old houses and former resort villas have been converted into solid bunkers, combined with natural barriers in narrow alleys, creating deadly choke points that smother every assault by Russian forces. The second key factor that gives Tokmakka an absolute defensive advantage is the timeless rule of military geography. This village is almost completely surrounded by natural high ground. In the history of human conflict, no matter how advanced the weapons are or how the battlefield evolves, one eternal truth has never changed. Whoever controls the high ground controls the battle. From these dominant high positions, the field of view is maximized, allowing the Ukrainian army to identify and intercept any enemy attempts to approach from a safe distance before they can get close to the front line. This means that the Kremlin commanders have absolutely no chance to create any element of surprise at Tokmakka. The Ukrainian defenders are always 2 steps ahead of the enemy, with artillery, unmanned aerial vehicles, and firepower systems locking onto targets, ready to strike at any sign of enemy movement. Thanks to this solid, advantageous position, the situation here has remained stable throughout the second half of 2023, continuing through all of 2024 and into the early months of 2025. However, the wheel of history once again turned in the second half of 2025. The stronghold faced a life-or-death challenge when the Kremlin shifted its strategy after months of stalemate and pointless losses on all fronts. The Russian General Staff launched a new large-scale offensive campaign, focusing on the southern front, especially the Zaporizhia region. Orders from the highest levels were issued, urgently demanding a breakthrough at any cost and as quickly as possible. This is a clear geopolitical calculation by the Russian military leadership and President Putin, aiming to paint a picture that Russia is dominating and achieving a comprehensive victory. It's something irreversible. This move is designed to create a superior position for the Kremlin at the negotiating table in the future. Not only with Ukraine, but also with the US and the European Union. Because in this geopolitical game, the more land you seize, the more strategic cards you hold. To realize that ambition, additional assault companies are continuously deployed to the battlefield, hoping to use waves of troops and overwhelming firepower to crush Ukraine's resilient defensive lines, to seize the resilient strongholds they have long coveted, including Tokmakka itself. Moving into October and November 2025, this entire area was engulfed in relentless bombardments and mechanized assaults on a scale never seen before. Standing firm against this storm were the brave soldiers of the 118th Independent Mechanized Brigade, part of Ukraine's 10th Army Corps. Through extraordinary resilience, they were honored by their brigade's spokesperson with the proud title, the Cyborgs of Tokmakka. This title continues the legacy of the legendary fighters who stubbornly defended Donetsk Airport from May 2014 to January 2015. Even when nearly completely isolated, facing harsh sub-zero winter conditions and relentless enemy shelling, these soldiers held their ground, etching their names into Ukraine's military history with unbreakable spirit. They may not be as widely recognized by the world media as their predecessors in Donetsk, but those now standing at the forefront in Tokmakka have proven an equally iron will, repelling wave after wave of Russian assaults to defend the village's sovereignty. One of the most tragic and heroic chapters of this confrontation unfolded on October 20th, 2025, when Russian forces launched one of the largest mechanized attacks since the war began, aiming to flatten this resilient position. To prepare for this decisive blow, the Russian military command assembled a massive assault group, including elite units from the 71st Mechanized Infantry Regiment, reinforced by 2 additional mechanized infantry companies, and about 26 armored vehicles, ranging from main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles to armored personnel carriers and troop transports. In pure military theory, such an overwhelming force and firepower could easily wipe out a fortified town, let alone a small frontline village. But on the battlefield, events unfolded in a completely opposite direction, turning Russia's ambitious effort into a disastrous and humiliating defeat. Under a hail of bombs and bullets, Ukraine's defenders showed their mettle, holding fast in their trenches and fortifications, making full use of every weapon and terrain advantage to unleash a deadly barrage on the advancing enemy. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield was littered with burning wrecks. The battle ended with at least 30 Russian soldiers killed, dozens more wounded, and an estimated 21 armored vehicles completely destroyed. Despite this harsh reality, perhaps due to pressure to save face or for internal propaganda, Russian military officials deliberately distorted the truth, boasting of a resounding victory. On November 16th, the Russian Ministry of Defense hastily issued a dramatic announcement, claiming full control over Tokmakka. Defense Minister Andrei Belousov declared the village fully liberated and said Moscow's forces were advancing toward their next long-term strategic objectives in the south. Ukraine immediately countered with evidence debunking these baseless claims. Just days later, even Russia's own official sources quietly withdrew their initial statements, reporting ongoing fierce battles around the village, a tacit admission contradicting their earlier claim of complete liberation. For weeks and months afterward, the Kremlin kept launching new waves of attacks, but all were stopped at the gates by Ukrainian defenders. The prolonged stalemate at this location has turned Tokmachka into an obsession, even a bitter joke. For the Russian media, as their military analysts kept declaring that the village was on the verge of collapse. Within the international military monitoring community, this name has become a deeply ironic phenomenon. Ukrainian netizens constantly edit together clips of the smug speeches by Russian military experts about their imagined successes, then compare them with the harsh reality. The army, called the world's second strongest, is powerless against a village of just a few hundred elderly residents holding out. This helplessness has wounded the Kremlin's pride so much that some Russian universities have imposed very harsh punishments. They threatened to expel any student who mocked or dared to openly point out the military failure at Tokmakka. But no ban can hide the truth. This is a historic defeat. By mid-May 2026, analysis from the United 24 media channel showed that the Russian siege of this small village has officially surpassed the milestone of 1,500 days of blood and fire. This terrifying number has placed Tokmakka among the ranks of the longest sieges ever recorded in the military history of mankind. It lasted longer than the Roman siege of Carthage. It lasted about 1,100 days, surpassing the infamous Great Siege of Sipranta with its 1,320 days, and ranking above even the epic tales or tragic events in history, such as Leningrad, Zom, Alexandria, Jerusalem, or Constantinople. The history of the world is full of lessons about powerful armies being forced to retreat before impregnable fortresses, unassailable, accepting the loss of tens of thousands of soldiers just to gain a tiny patch of fortified ground. However, the crucial difference that makes Russia's defeat at Tokmakka more humiliating than ever lies in the fact that the historical lessons mentioned above are all associated with major besieged cities, protected by solid stone walls, sturdy iron gates, and layers of defending troops. Moreover, these events took place centuries ago, at a time when humanity only had primitive weapons like spears, bows, or catapults. Meanwhile, in this modern era, the Kremlin possesses the power of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, jet fighters, suicide drones, and advanced long-range artillery positions. But all of them are powerless against a poor rural village, a stretch of devastated land, scarred by tens of thousands of bomb craters, and with almost no intact houses left. This isn't a fortified capital. There aren't tens of thousands of militia, nor is a regular army corps stationed here. The helplessness of a military superpower against such an unknown target is a devastating blow to Russia's reputation. For decades before this conflict broke out, the world always looked at the Russian military with a sense of caution, if not outright fear. Global powers used to be concerned about the seemingly endless arsenal of weapons, the massive armored divisions, and Moscow's overwhelming military manpower. The world used to hold its breath watching the grand parades on Red Square, where Russian officials showcased the power of their new generation strategic missiles and tanks that were advertised as unbeatable. Everyone thought that this invincible war machine would crush any obstacle in its path. However, all of that mythical glory The armored might that the Kremlin painstakingly built to intimidate the world is now being torn apart right on the Zaporizhia front. Events like those at Tokmachka are ironclad proof that the Russian army is not as strong or as invincible as they claim to be. An army that couldn't even subdue a rural village after more than 45 lines of resistance, accepting losses estimated at up to 2,404 soldiers and dozens of modern combat vehicles. They spent tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars from the war budget, only to end up with absolutely nothing in return. Up to this point, this resilient land still firmly remains in the hands of Ukraine's 118th Mechanized Brigade. Those soldiers remain in the underground trenches. They flexibly and intelligently use a combination of drones, minefields, and artillery to always stay one step ahead of the enemy, breaking every offensive plan. Even the most hawkish commentators and Russia's top propaganda writers have bitterly admitted the helplessness of their own troops, with some even comparing Tokmachka to, like a 21st century Troy or Verdun, symbols of the most terrible attrition and deadlock in the history of warfare. So, in your opinion, will the Kremlin accept to continue sacrificing troops at all costs at this position to save face at the negotiating table with the US and EU?